yesterday.
Okay, welcome all to the Edinburgh Centre. Thank you students for coming, travelling from further afield, not so far afield, and welcome also to the institutional partners that are over here as well. And this lecture, as part of our online lecture series, is continuing a lecture that we initiated in the previous semester, where we invited a member of the Scottish National Party to come and talk about his political views. And I thought in the requirement for balance, it would be nice to invite a member of the Scottish Parliament to present an opposing view. So I'm delighted to introduce David Stewart, who is a current member of the Scottish Parliament, represents the Labour Party, whose platform is currently more in favour of sustaining a union between Scotland and England in the upcoming 2014 referendum. And I know David's going to talk about that and perhaps some other issues that are important to the Labour Party in Scotland. So thank you very much, David, for coming and speaking to us today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Thompson, and ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I would say in your honour I'm wearing my tartan Scottish Parliament tie. I would stress I don't always wear a tartan tie. I'm not a stereotyped Scot, so it's a great honour to be here and to wear my favourite tie. Whilst I haven't been to Arcadia University, I have been fortunate enough in a previous life when I was in Westminster to do a committee visit to Philadelphia. And at that time, I had the honour with my committee members of meeting Ed Rendell, who you'll know was the mayor of Philadelphia, and I understand was later the governor of the state. So he was extremely positive and friendly when he met all my parliamentarian colleagues who were cross-party groups. And he told me a story. He took me into his room with all my committee friends to show a picture of him at one of the Democratic conferences with Edward Kennedy, the late Edward Kennedy. And he actually told me that he nominated Edward Kennedy when he was standing against Jimmy Carter to be the Democratic nominee for president. So that little bit of trivia has always remained in my brain. So, and also another event in London. I was just telling Hamish at the Emory University events that we attend on a regular basis that I was fortunate enough actually to be at a major conference with Edward Kennedy, and that was a great privilege. I didn't meet him personally. There was a couple hundred people there, but it was a tremendous privilege to meet Edward Kennedy. So I'm a very strong fan of the American political system, particularly Democrats, as you may imagine. But I really think today what I want to do was really speak to you for about 10 minutes. So then I've got jobs for you. I think it's really important that we have a comprehensive set of questions and answers at the end of this. So please think of the questions. If there's a burning question now, please let me know. But hopefully at the end of my speech you'll have lots of comments. So what I'd like to do this evening is make the case for the Better Together campaign. So what is that about? So the case is for a strong, devolved Scottish Parliament within the United Kingdom. So Scotland wants certainty and it wants stability. So that's what our current constitutional settlement allows. So let me talk about the process issue. How did we get to this point? Well, one of the key points, I think, was the Edinburgh Agreement, and that was between the Prime Minister and the First Minister. So what does it sort? Well, first important point, an unchallengeable vote in 2014. And you may say, well, what's that about? Surely, if you've got a referendum, that's all you need. Well, the problem is the Scottish Parliament doesn't have the powers to actually have a referendum, so we needed Westminster to agree that there wouldn't be a court challenge at that stage. Who can vote? Well, all electors in Scotland. You probably understand that. The second is that there'll be a new age group to vote, and that will be 16 and 17-year-olds who can't currently vote in Scotland at present. Now, my own view about that, Hamish, is fine. I think I've always been a fan for 16-year-olds having the ability to vote and 17-year-olds, but not just for the referendum. I think it's important for all elections in Scotland that they have a vote, and I think that's about democracy for young people. The other issue is there's a simple majority So if there's one more vote in favour of yes, or the other way round, that's it. Now, in the past, some of you may be aware of this, for those who are the political anoraks in the audience, that in the 1970s, when Labour put forward a referendum, there was a 40% rule introduced by a Labour, unfortunately, MP called George Cunningham. And that said there had to be a 40% element to the vote. It wasn't a simple majority. I have to say, in fairness, that George Cunningham did join the SDP. I'm sure some of you are aware of the SDP, who are they actually folded and joined up with the Liberal Democrats, but they were a sort of centralist party that was doing actually very well in the 1980s. In fact, in 1983, Labour just crept ahead of them into second place, and if they hadn't done that, it could have been the Labour Party that was no more, rather than the SDP. So that's a very important point. I was speaking to an SNP insider the other day, and he said to me, if we win by one vote, just imagine that, one vote, we only need to be lucky once. Now, it's not like football or baseball, where your team might do badly one Saturday, and the next Saturday you can get back and get your own back. Remember, this is huge historic significance. If the referendum's for yes or no, and I'm not knocking the democracy here, the Scottish people vote one way, that's fine, I'm a Democrat. But they only need to be lucky once. And they have big pockets. And again, you should say, well, why don't your side get more financial support? They have around 5 million, which is quite serious financial support. They've got a couple of millionaires. One of their strong supporters won the lottery and proceeded to give £1 million. Just their luck, isn't it, after what they've done. So very, very, very successful. And we're obviously concerned. I would stress as well that the Better Together isn't a political party. It's made up, as you know, from Labour. It's made up of the Conservatives and the Lib Dems. It will come to an end once the referendum's over. It won't be standing for office in any way. So Alistair Darling, my old boss, is the chair, and I've been to several meetings with him recently. But in a counter to this only get lucky once, one of my ex-colleagues, Brian Wilson, used to be the Labour Energy Minister, who set up, just for interest, the West Highland Free Press, which is a good example of cooperative newspapers. He said, the forces of reaction exist in Scotland every bit as much as the other parts of the UK. It was the voters of the Yorkshire miners and the Lancashire mill workers which helped deliver a national health service and a welfare state. It wasn't the Edinburgh consultants and the Fife colliery workers, which I thought was a very neat way of explaining it. So what about timing? Well, the timing's with the Scottish Government for the referendum, but there is a sunset clause. So in other words, they can't go beyond the end of 2014. So we don't know the exact date yet. Now, obviously, critics like me would say, well, how crazy is this? There isn't detriment of the SNP as independents. That's what they were set up to do. And that's a perfectly acceptable political position. I just don't happen to agree with it. But surely you would have at least the date. But we think it's going to be in the autumn next year. So that's the best having that. Well, can I do a few scenarios? What if yes? Let's just assume this. Now, clearly I'm not here representing the SNP, and some observers will say, well, you're giving a very biased view of this, but I'm trying to put forward my view of what I've picked up from the press and the Parliament. What will happen if there's a yes vote? In other words, Scotland is going to become independent. Well, not immediately, that's the first point. There will be a 2-year interim period until the Scottish Parliament elections of 2016, which would, interestingly enough, be the first independence elections. Now, there's a wider argument. Will it be the same number of MSPs, 129? Will it be the same electoral systems? Will it be the same chamber? Will it be the same Parliament? I mean, there are questions that has to be asked on that. At one level, although I'm not a nationalist, you could easily make the case for saying if you've got a fully independent country of 5.5 million rather than devolved, surely you need more members. I mean, I personally can see the logic of that. I'm hasten to add, this is not my party's policy. I will make the point there is an argument for that. But there will be a 2-year negotiation period up to 2016. An important point, though, was that the First Minister said that there would be, in March 2016, would be the actual Independence Month, effectively. So it's quite fly that, because that's just before the elections. Because you could imagine a scene where we've got independence, but Labour wins the election. Now, how bizarre would that be? But that is a real possibility. The other rather unlucky point is that there'll still be a 2015 general election, whatever, because independence won't take place till 2016. So what will happen? Will people get elected for less than a year and give up? Well, they have to give up because we're not part of the United Kingdom, which is what the Westminster elections are about. So what has not been resolved, I think, in the Edinburgh Agreement is what is the worked out plan of what independence means in practice. The Yes campaign criticised my side for being very negative. And I think it was Alistair Darling who made quite interesting point, which I will steal and tell you today. It's not a question of how being negative, it's a question of being realistic. So I just put it back to your own situation. If you, each person in this room, if you start a new job, a new course, I'm sure many of you are thinking of doing, or you want to move house, you would all take a hard-nosed cost-benefit analysis of, is it worth doing this versus what I've currently got? You know, moving house, but is this house bigger, better area? You have to take a hard-nosed, critical decision about these choices, and that's a fair minor issue of moving house compared to a completely new constitutional settlement. And as the historians in the room will know, it's not like, you know, Scotland was conquered in 1707 and we want to get back to being our proud independence freedom. Obviously, 1707 was by agreement of the Scottish people. Now again, historians in the room will say there might be some criticism about the role of the rich and the powerful on that, but the key point, it wasn't after a conquest. So I mean, it's quite important to look at the historical context we're talking about. Okay, let's keep on this theme of what happens if there is a yes vote. What about setting of interest rates? Clearly absolutely crucial in any economy. It's vital for the cost of borrowing, as you know, for business, the cost for individual mortgages that people like myself will pay, because that dictates obviously the cost of your mortgage rate. It influences growth and expansion, and that's all done by the Bank of England. Well, the Yes campaigners are saying the Bank of England will continue to set interest rates for Scotland. So, as John Lamont, my leader, said, what sort of freedom and independence is that? I mean, a foreign country will still be setting the interest rates, which dictates the financial circumstance of which you run your own independent country. The second issue is that there's no automatic membership of the Monetary Policy Commission, which are the key elders of the Bank of England that set the interest rates. Although the interest rates, just to stress, as you probably know, are a device to control inflation, and the target is 2%. So the lever to control inflation is interest rates. And my government in '97, when we got in, the first thing we did, in fact, within 2 days, which is probably a miracle in modern political movements, we made the Bank of England completely independent. So decisions on interest rates used to be the Chancellor. And I remember the infamous day, I think it was Black Wednesday, where when the Tories were in power under John Major, when interest rates went up 3 times in one day. And on memory, the highest rate got to was 15.75%. Now that's just the bank rate, and as you know, what the ordinary person pays, it's normally 3% more. So your base rates, your normal rates probably get around 20% if your base rate's 15.75. Imagine that, and you would have taken that at 5%. So I mean that's a huge change. So bank rates are crucially important levers. So I think independence was a good thing, and in fairness, the coalition in Westminster have kept the independence of the Bank of England, and I think that actually is a good one. There is technically some override powers, you know, in extremis you could take that power back, but I do support the current position. The other issue would be that the way that the Monetary Policy Committee make the decision, and I bet some of their advisors, is they send advisors all around Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales and England, and they talk to business, they work out what the economic condition is each part of the UK, they report back, and then they make recommendations on inflation, which is the interest rate changes. Obviously, if you were a foreign country, there wouldn't be that Scottish assessment. The rate would be the rate for England and Wales. It wouldn't be the rate for Scotland, if you understand me. Sorry, just to be clear on that. The rate would apply to Scotland, but wouldn't reflect the Scottish economic situation. That's probably a better way of putting it. Of course, the wider picture is, for the euro, you've got a much exaggerated situation because the rate that's fixed there is for all the euro countries, and that's horrendous. So what's good for Germany, as we know, isn't good for Spain, and certainly isn't good for Greece. So that's probably another example of concerns I've got about how independent would an independent Scotland be if the bank rate's still been fixed and is at the same rate as it currently is. What then about bank regulation? The same as in America with Lehman Brothers and so on. You've had huge issues in the States, as we've had, about regulation of bankers, credit agencies and everything else. Just a couple of points on bank regulation. The UK government passed legislation to disband the Financial Services Authority in favour of a 3-pronged approach to regulation. There's going to be a Prudential Regulatory Authority, which is going to be a subsidiary of the Bank of England, and that will be in charge of regulating banks and insurance companies. The second aspect is there'll be a Financial Conduct Authority, which will be independent of the Bank of England, which will be tasked with consumer protection and overseeing the conduct of business. And finally, there's going to be a Financial Policy Committee, which is independent and charged with identifying, monitoring and reducing risks to economic stability from inside the Bank of England. Now, the SNP have announced they plan to ask these regulatory agencies again to oversee business and banking in Scotland. At one level, that's fine. I'm not sure they've actually approached them yet, and I'm not sure, I'm pretty certain of this, there's no contingency plan in case these agencies say no. Probably one of the most contentious areas has been membership of the EU. And as you know, there's been a long and rocky road with Britain going back in time when we applied unsuccessfully to join the EU. That was particularly at the time when de Gaulle was leader of France. That was a very difficult time, and eventually under Edward Heath's premiership, there was a referendum as well under Harold Wilson, but there was a successful joining of the EU. So we were one of the older countries in the EU, and it's clearly, I think, matches the States now for the size of the economic zone that it covers. So it is a very important market for us. And in my area in Highlands and Islands, one of the key things that we found as benefit area is the use of structural funds, which can be matched with public funds. And we've done things, for example, build bridges. We've helped through European Social Fund to develop training opportunities so that the GDP of the lagging region, which my area is moved up near the European average. So I'm certainly a strong supporter because I've seen the success in structural funds for areas like mine, which has poor roads, has a lot of young people leaving the area, problems with education and infrastructure development, like broadband development, for example. However, what's going to happen if we're independent? Well, Romana Prodi, who's the former president of the European Commission, said in 2004 that a newly independent region would become a third country, a sort of technical term, with respect to the European Union. The SNP say that Scotland will continue as members and keep inherent opt-outs, but normally new members don't get opt-outs, so there's some key things that were negotiated. For example, Margaret Thatcher. I'm not one often to mention Margaret Thatcher in polite company, but under the Fontainebleau arrangement, she actually did arrange to get sort of a payback to the UK, who were a net contributor to Europe, and that's been quite an important element of our current understanding. Obviously, we've opted out of the euro, which has been very, very important for us. I'm not a lawyer, and some of you will be, and there's been different legal advice, but I think the key issue is that if Scotland leaves, our UK will inherit the EU membership. Our UK is the rest of the UK, so that's basically England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And there's been quite a lot of legal advice about that. I'm happy to answer maybe technical questions later on. But this is a huge area, one of great concern, because surely that's a very basic thing. You know, you want to be in Europe, that's their policy. They were in favour of Europe and now they're not. But the SNP actually took a legal challenge to the Information Commissioner, which are ruling that they must reveal their legal advice it was received on EU membership for independent Scotland. And the reason they dropped it was they hadn't obtained legal advice on whether they were going to be part of the EU or not. Now that is really crass. They got a real hard time in Parliament about this. So they spent £4,000 hiding information that didn't exist, which is kind of strange to say the least. So what would the currency be? Well, they're now changed, and we now know the position is they're going to use the pound. So, free independent Scotland will have its interest rate set by a foreign country, will be using the currency of a foreign country, so there's some issues around that. Normally, and I'm not saying this is totally exclusive, I was over in Serbia just a few weeks ago and they're number 2 to join, and they're very keen to join the exchange rate mechanism and then the euro, and Croatia is next in line and they're going to join the euro as well. Normally you would expect to join the euro. There's some technical things around about that, but that's what it's the state of play. The reason we're not in the euro because we weren't a new entrant country. We were a long-standing country. We negotiated an opt-out, and that was agreed. So there's a world of difference between new member and existing member. And so that's just to put that on the record. Obviously, in Scotland, moving to defence. Defence is really important for us in Scotland, particularly on the procurement side. We've also had a strong track record. Obviously, the military contribution that Scots made, Second World War and in peacekeeping events in Kosovo and so on, has been quite dramatic. In my Westminster days, I was privileged enough to be part of the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme, and some of you may have experience in the US and forces, I'm sure. But my experience was 2 terms with the RAF, So it was about 28 days that time. So I mean, that was a fantastic experience. I did get to know a little bit more about particularly the RAF than I would have done without that. So one of the foreign trips they had me on was meant to be Cyprus, which is quite straightforward. Unfortunately, there was a technical problem with the plane, so I spent the week in Basra instead in Iraq, so that was quite a different experience than I was expecting. So I was pleased, however, to be part of that, because obviously that was something that Labour felt was crucially important to work with the States on. But meeting ordinary men and women, many of them, I was really impressed at how young so many of them were. I mean, it's because I was getting old, but I mean, they were like 20, 21, 23 in Iraq, and said, well, that's what we've signed up to do. So the RAF is very important for us in Scotland, both in the defence area, but also in search and rescue, and I'll come back to that. So we just stress the importance of having the RAF, having the Navy, and having the Army in Scotland, and of course the procurement as well. So what's their policy? Well, there was a huge change for the SNP, and it was difficult for them. I'm not being sympathetic to them, I'm going to make the point it was a difficult decision. They always had a very anti-nuclear stance, and many of you in this room, I'm sure, will have a very strong anti-nuclear stance as well. There's nothing wrong with that. But they were always anti-NATO and anti-Trident, but they changed their policy to say they would actually remain in NATO, which obviously is a nuclear umbrella, which of course America is a very key player. But we moved Trident. So Trident will go across the border to England, where we'd still have the nuclear shield, but not in Scotland. So that's it, I think, in a nutshell. Two of their MSPs, they've got 69, I think, two of their MSPs from my patch resigned the whip and are now independents because of that. That was quite a blow to them. They still have an overall majority, but they only have, 69 is not a huge group, but losing two, is a worry to them. And obviously I wouldn't want to lose any of my group either, but it was quite a difficult issue. So what about the costs of that? Well, there's, to set up your own Army, Navy, Royal Air Force equivalent is kind of frightening from scratch, because remember, you wouldn't be part of the British Army, the British Navy, or the British RAF. There's huge costs involved. There's also issues about the employment, because the direct employment of soldiers, sailors and airmen is vitally important in Scotland. But in order to do that, of course, you have two bits of negotiation. You have to negotiate with the UK, and you would still have to negotiate, obviously, with NATO to say, yeah, okay, I'm a new country, but I want to join. Now, that might be a smoother path than the EU, but nevertheless, it's not an automatic and it's not a given. And I wouldn't even go down the legal advice route. I have no idea if they're taking legal advice on this, but they haven't on many other aspects, which seems a bit slack to me, but you may say I would say that, wouldn't I? The other key thing, I think, is procurement. You know that the massive aircraft carrier that has been built on the Clyde, and we've been building other frigates as well. So that's been a huge source of employment in Scotland. We've had quite a proud, unfortunately declining shipbuilding industry in Scotland. And the techie people tell me that no naval vessel since the Second World War has been procured out with the UK. And that's because the UK is exempt from the EU procurement condition in light of security concerns. So the point that you've probably guessed I'm going to say is, why would our UK build its naval vessels in Scotland? Now, I'm not talking Scotland down in this, I'm putting a practical worrying concern to you all. The other issues are, well, how many regiments are we going to have? They've attempted to do some points in this, but it's still pretty vague. How many bases? And remember, the RAF's not just about defence, it's also about search and rescue. You'll probably all recall Piper Alpha, which was the dreadful fire in the oil rig, which was, I think, beyond the easy reach of helicopters. And so the fixed wing were used. That's the Nimrod that you've probably heard of. This is now unfortunately discontinued, but this massive aircraft was sent out from the bases in Murray to help monitor the rescue at Piper Alpha. We don't have that fixed wing anymore. But we do have other aircraft that can be used. So there is a big issue about what sort of search and rescue capability will there be in independent Scotland. So I've given you worries and doubts. My analogy with jobs, course, house, I think was important. But I'm not just going to spend all the time giving you some question marks about independence. I'm also wanting to give you some positive messages about why I believe that we should stay in the current situation. But I would stress this is not about exciting new independence versus tired old status quo, and I'll come back and explain that point in a minute or two. Well, why are we better together? Well, we've had a very successful partnership. I mentioned that earlier from the 1707 point. We've got real strengths. I don't want to be running the MOD or embassies or foreign affairs. We've got a strong job to do in a devolved Scotland. and we've got quite enough to do there, thank you very much. And we're not some, no disrespect to City Halls, but we're not some souped up City Hall. I mean, the current budget roughly is around £34 billion. I mean, that's quite serious money to spend for the good of Scotland in housing and in our health services and education. If you give me one example, Alistair Darling made this point, as you know, he was the Chancellor in the last Labour government. He made the point a few weeks ago in speaking of Inverness, is the bank crisis, which saved banks at the RBS and so on, involved several times the amount of the Scottish budget. So in the best will of the world, there's no way a devolved administration or even an independent country would have the wherewithal to have done that. He tells the story he was approached, I think it was RBS, with saying, Alistair, I've got a crisis, we're in a real financial problem here, I need some help from government. And he said, well, when do you need a decision? He says, well, in 3 hours would be fine. Seriously, that was how close it was. It was in the region of, I think, £300 billion he was able to access immediately by contacting the Fed and contacting other economic agencies. So the banks were actually effectively nationalised. They were going to go under, and as you know, it's the domino theory. Once one or two of these big banks, I think I'm right in saying the RBS at the time was the biggest bank in the world, it was a massive bank. So imagine if that had gone down, the effect on the UK and the effect on the other banking. So, I mean, he effectively saved the banks through that very quick action and his great relationships with the States and other key players. So I would stress that point that, is that there's a scale issue. We can do that because, the scale for 60 million is going to have more powerful muscle than 5 million is the simple issue in a partnership situation. And the other issue, and again it goes without saying, is that England is of course our biggest customer and our most crucial customer. And the Scottish Parliament is in the process of getting more powers and given more accountability in raising and in spending funds. So this is the issue, it's not status quo. The new powers have been approved and they're coming in force in a drip feed, but they'll all be in place by 2016. So that's crucially important to say. So there's more powers within the devolved settlement using the strength of the UK to do a lot more for the ordinary man and woman in the street in Scotland. And there is obviously a growing trend of working together at Europe. I mean, countries I mentioned earlier when I was in Belgrade, they're desperate to join the EU. They're desperate to come together because they know that in a large market, and the security issues about the EU is crucially important. That's why they want to join. Why is it that effectively, we're cutting away from a larger unit when other countries are desperate to get together? I would also stress the importance of shared services. Now, you well know that health is fully devolved in Scotland, so we have the complete power to deal with that. The government has through the devolved settlement, but that doesn't mean we ignore what happens in England and Wales. For example, cross-border operations. In Newcastle, I think it is, specialises in heart transplants. That's very specialised. I don't think that happens, or it's very limited level that happens in Scotland. When I chaired the petitions committee and we had a petition about chronic pain. The chronic pain centre in the UK is actually Bath in England. It's not in Scotland. So patients from Scotland travel there on a regular basis because we're part of the UK and we share services. The Royal Mail. We've got a fantastic service, as you know, with its universal service obligation, which again you'll know means that whether you're posting it to Buccleuch Place or to the Outer Western Isles, it's the same cost and it's delivered by the post office across the network, and it goes back hundreds of years. It's a very well established postal system. More spooky things like the shared services, obviously MI5, and I don't claim I'm an expert on that, I do watch books, but I know in my parliamentary role that we've certainly had advice about our new security that we've just been, you'll probably see in the Parliament, we're just building currently. They do have a role, in the Democratic Society, the Passport Agency, but particularly important Inland Revenue. It's not everybody's favourite organisation, but I saw a leaked memo which the Party put round recently, today in fact, from John Swinney, who's the Financial Secretary, saying that the cost of setting up the equivalent in Scotland would be £600 million. Because obviously Inland Revenue is the rest of the UK service, it's not Scottish service, it will go if we're independent. Now polls in terms of how we were going to vote in next year, well obviously I can't tell you exactly, but what I can tell you in the polls is that they show changes, but they've increasingly shown that the majority of Scots are opposed to independence, including, interestingly enough, new voters. And you probably know that Glasgow University students voted overwhelmingly in favour of the No campaign, or the Better Together campaign, just recently. Now I was going to raise the issue of credit rating. You probably say to me, well, that's not a very wise thing to do after the UK's just degraded by one notch. although I have to hasten to add it wasn't my lot that were involved at this time. I mean, we are second from the top. Obviously, you know, AAA is the best credit rating, and we're just one below that. And again, you'll know that is vitally important, because what that does is it tells the rest of the world, although there were some issues around the collateralised debt obligations in the States, but I won't go there. But currently what it says is, you know, this is a good product. It means that your equities would have actually a lower interest rate, because the UK has never defaulted in any bonds that's put out. If you're a dodgier, inverted commas, country, a very good technical term, with a very low credit rating in the Bs or the Cs, you have to give a much higher bond yield to attract investors, because you may lose your money as an investor. So that is good for the country. That means our cost of borrowing is lower, actually. So although we've dropped one, I mean, it's seen as still pretty sound. The problem is that a new independent country would get a completely new assessment. I have my doubts it will have anything like an A, and that means it's much more expensive to borrow. And of course, the current debt you'll have, either the debt from the rest of the UK or your current debt, is much more difficult to service, much more expensive to service. So I have real doubts around the issue about credit rating. Well, what do you think Scotland wants, I suppose, is the question I put out. Well, I mentioned earlier about the capital spending. 2016, we're going to have £5 billion extra borrowing, and that's serious, quite serious money. My view is, and I think the government's got plans for this, but my view is we need to look at things like affordable housing. The great advantage of affordable housing is it ticks the box for the sort of social democrat part of me, because there's a huge need in Scotland, as I'm sure there is in the States, for affordable housing. It's very difficult to buy. Again, you have similar experiences, I'm sure, across the pond. It's very difficult for young people to get a mortgage, partly because there's been changes in funding rules, and it's very hard even to get a 90% mortgage. So, I mean, who's going to have 30, 40 grand at 20, to buy a house? So there's huge problems around that. So affordable housing is good because it helps young people and families particularly have a roof over their heads. The other key thing is it stimulates employment among building craftsmen and so on, and that's a good multiplier effect, because that money tends to get spent within Scotland. Also, I think railways and roads are also good use of spend, because they're really important for business and for tourism and for local communications as well. The other issue is, and at one level I can see this from an academic point of view, because you've got to bear in mind that effectively Labour and SNP are very closely positioned. We're both central left parties. The SNP want independence, we don't. That's a very crude summary. So for them to say, aren't the Tories horrible? Well, yes, because we're going to. Aren't they terrible about welfare? Yes. Are they not cutting too hard and too deep? Yes. So the solution is vote yes next year, and you get rid of the horrible Tories. The slight fault in that logic is, as you probably spotted, that's assuming that the Tories will be in power forever. And the polls for Westminster are putting us consistently ahead. And I'm not suggesting for a second that we're home and dry. I'll never say that. But I do believe that we have a very real chance of winning the general election. The other techie point is that the Lib Dems, the coalition, voted down the boundary changes, which would have given the Tories a 30-seat advantage before you start, and that advantage doesn't exist now. So I'm very pleased for once for the Lib Dems. That was a good move. I think they had their own reasons for their own seats, but nevertheless. So if you're then saying, but in 2015 you're going to have a left of centre Labour government that's not going to be cutting welfare and going to be going down a socialist agenda, then that takes that argument completely away. And they have been playing this argument very strongly indeed. The last thing the SNP want is a Labour to win in 2015. And I suppose in the final few minutes before your lots of questions, I hope, I'd like to finish with some sort of positive points. I was thinking over the last few weeks about, why is this important to me as an individual MSP, and I'm sure over the next year and a half I'll be using this probably 20 or 30 times in meetings across the Highlands and Islands. My view, and this will be shared by the SNP, but obviously as a Scot I love Scotland, and obviously I'm ambitious for Scotland's people and Scotland's possibility. But the key point I'd like to emphasise is that I'm not arguing that Scotland can't survive as a separate country. I just think there's a better choice in the future. I believe the stronger argument is a strong Scottish Parliament with new powers within the United Kingdom gives us the best of both worlds. It's got real decision making, power here in Scotland, as well as a key role in a strong and secure UK. So now in the future, Scotland is stronger as part of the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom, which is an important point, is stronger with Scotland as a partner. And if you look at the UK, the BBC and the Bank of England were both founded by Scots. The NHS was founded by a Welshman, and the state pension system was founded by an Englishman. They're partners in these islands working together, and I believe that's why we're better together. And I mentioned the war earlier, but we are proud, obviously, that we fought together in the United Kingdom and obviously with the United States to defeat fascism. And we worked together after the war under the Labour government of Attlee to build the welfare state and the National Health Service. But the case we make is about what's best for Scotland's future. Now, we know things are tough at home, and they're very turbulent internationally. Every day we open the paper, it's another worry, particularly about Syria. I also think that Scotland's prosperity would be strengthened by keeping the British connection, because we need more growth, we need more jobs, and we need more prosperity in Scotland. What we don't need, and remember this is not an election campaign for 4 weeks, we're not going to have a decision on this until next year, and even if it is a yes, it's going to be another 2 years before we have the negotiation. So we don't need uncertainty, we don't need instability, and we don't need barriers for business. So in these tough and turbulent times, the size, the strength and the stability of the UK economy is a huge advantage for Scottish business. And I believe that the UK, as the world's oldest and its most successful single market, and the UK has the oldest and most successful currency, which is the pound. I've said before that the rest of the UK is Scotland's largest export market, and if you look at the business context, business increasingly have to win orders against smart, efficient and productive firms in foreign markets. Now, these competitive challenges will only get harder in the years to come, but I believe that the UK is a much better place than a separate Scotland or England to help our business find and win new orders across the world. And I mentioned earlier that the UK Treasury used $470 billion to bail out the Scottish-based banks during the financial crisis. It's probably the MSP trying to help me. So this is not a debate, as I said at the start, between independence and a static, unchanging, devolved settlement. We're witnessing one of the biggest transfers of financial powers in Scotland since the creation of the UK 300 years ago. So the new Act allows the Scottish Parliament to set income tax rates in Scotland and enables Holyrood to borrow more money. And as well as bringing in a new Scottish rate of income tax and borrowing powers of $5 billion, the Scotland Act of last year will hand powers over air guns, drink driving and speed limits to Holyrood. It will also devolve stamp duty, land tax, landfill tax and give the Scottish Parliament a voice in appointments to broadcasting and the Crown Estate Commissioners. And in addition, there are new procedures for Scottish criminal courts cases that will go to the UK Supreme Court. So, in conclusion, in the last few minutes, I just say that there are crucial players in this referendum. I believe that jobs, prosperity and growth are the key ingredients for Scotland. And I believe that a newly empowered Scottish Parliament is the best way forward, and I hope for a vote to get better together in a year's time in the referendum. Now, once we decide to stay, we can get past the debate on constitutional reform and take action to transform Scottish society. And I believe a new chapter in social democracy is ready to be opened. And to conclude by quoting Sir Walter Scott, what we need is the will to do and the soul to dare. Thank you very much. So I'd now be happy to take questions, points, observations, and if it's a very technical point and I need to speak to a friend or phone a friend, I'll make sure that I send a note back to Hamish for you to forward on. But who's going to be first? Yes.
You mentioned a lot about the economy. I think in 2008 with the financial crisis, it kind of exacerbated a lot of the problems you were talking about. Like it really magnified the problems with being able to set your own interest rate and how much bailout money the banks needed. My question is, how much do you think the financial crisis hurt a movement for Scottish independence? Would your view be different before that financial crisis?
In terms of how much, I think it did hurt the independence movement. They often quote the, if you heard of the phrase, the Ark of Prosperity, if you come across that, where they quoted a whole series of Scandinavian countries and Republic of Ireland and so on. Now, the Republic of Ireland has gone through a nightmare situation. It's been downgraded. People are left with, they had a huge boom in the Republic. There was lots of buying of property and people have been left with properties they can't sell. They've had huge problems with unemployment and young people, I've certainly spoken to, have left the area. They don't use that term anymore. So I think that the financial crisis has shown that it's very difficult for small countries to be able to withstand that. And the work that Alistair did, and I would say that, wouldn't I? But I seriously think that Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling weren't given the credit for actually working with people in your country to actually save not just the UK but the world banking system, because it was the banks were all going down, and we only could do that because we had the mass of 60 million people behind us and the financial muscle and credibility to do that. A smaller independent country just wouldn't be in a position to do that. And we were very interconnected, that's the key. You know, we are very interconnected with the UK and with Europe. Okay? Yeah.
How much of the Quebec situation have you analyzed, this Quebec situation in Canada? Because it's really interesting listening to you present some of these points at the beginning in terms of your points against independence, because they were very similar to what, the point about, I could go and talk about how separatists in Quebec argued that when they left, if they seceded from Canada, they'd still be members of NATO, and that was not true. They'd still be members of NAFTA.
Well,
no, there's very similar, interesting points there. And then the other thing that was really interesting is that I'm just thinking of ways that oftentimes I think these two cases are seen as similar, and they're not. There's some big differences, and you made a really key point about 1707, because in Quebec, of course, they were conquered in 1759, and that's really kind of, they look back, and so you're making an interesting argument that the Scots aren't a conquered people. This is a voluntary. That's correct, right?
Yes, and there's certainly been some discussion about the Quebec position. I wasn't aware of these technical points. I'll certainly pass that on to our Better Together campaigners. It's a very, very interesting point about it. But the key point I would stress is, of course, Scotland could go independent and it could survive. I'm basically making the point there's a much stronger, much better way. I mean, take the oil revenues, for example. Well, obviously, it's fantastic we've got the ability of oil and gas in the UK continental shelf. The problem, as you well know, is that oil is a very volatile substance, and it's very, very dangerous to rely on a very small source of income because of the volatility of the price. And obviously, if you compare it with the UK, the revenues that oil represent are much smaller as a percentage in the UK than they are in Scotland. Now, so there is a worry around that, and the great danger is that decisions, as Alistair Darling was saying just a few weeks ago, about, let's open another field or let's do this development, aren't going to be made either by UK politicians or not going to be made by an independent Prime Minister or First Minister. As you know, they're made in Houston and they're made in Texas. These were decisions were made about extra drilling, and it's a real issue. Of course, the tax regime is an element of that, but the actual decision making is made by the companies, which are by and large American rather than Scottish owned. I mean, there's a tangential point to make that when we really discovered oil, there was an argument about how much conditionality we could put into people developing it. I think Tony Benn was the minister at the time. I think there was a real worry that if we were too slow in getting this up and running, we'd miss an opportunity. We also set up an offshore supplies office, which meant that you were meant to try and source your goods for oil workers, for example, through the UK. Unfortunately, that came to an end. I think the Tories cut that. And there's now quite tricky EU procurement rules that restrict your ability to dictate what has to happen from buying Scottish goods. So thank you for that point. I'll pass that one on. Other points? Yes.
If the Scottish people do vote yes on the referendum, what areas of the Scottish government and economy do you believe will need to be closely tied with England?
Well, it's a good point. Well, the first point to stress is that there will be a gap, as I said in my talk, between the referendum result next year and the independence date, which is March 2016, and then of course the election for the first Scottish Parliament, which will be in elections I'm due up in next 2016. Let's assume, they're obviously a foreign country, they're negotiating with the EU first of all, because the point I made about structural funds, if we're not in Europe, we won't be getting any structural funds. Clearly, the issue about interest rates will be set without any discussion. So if you're the finance minister in the new Scottish Parliament, which is independent, your ability to dictate your budget will be, you won't have the block grant anymore. You obviously have Scottish taxation, but you don't actually have a mechanism for raising it. So, but anyway, there will be taxation. You'll still have an income coming in. You'll have the oil revenues. You'll have some of the debt from the UK as a whole to try and balance that out. I think there would have to be, first point is about the cross-border trade issue. We're not going to want to lose lots of our customers from England. I've heard some evidence that tourism, which is the Highlands and Islands' biggest seller, that we've had a real reduction in English visitors coming to the Highlands, and the line that they don't want us, we don't want them. Now, in fairness, that was just one to tell, so I wouldn't want you to get the wrong impression of it. Certainly around the economy, we really have to make sure that we continue the policy of upskilling our workforce. And we have to look very carefully about the shipbuilding issue, where we're not going to get naval contracts from the UK. So it's to see how we can maybe diversify the industry. And certainly in new technologies. And look, basically what we're going to have to develop is what's our unique selling proposition in Scotland. What is it Scotland's got a comparative advantage on? And some of that will still exist. It's not going to change overnight. But I would be worried about lower credit rating, your hands being tied by another country setting. It's not just the interest rates, also some of the financial conditions as well. That's quite frightening. So there's lots of question marks. I mean, it is a leap into the dark. But I do understand the great emotional hold that independence has. And someone, I think it was Jim Sillars, who's a famous Labour and then SNP deputy leader, said that some Scots are just 90-minute patriots. In other words, 90 minutes into a football match, that they cheer Scotland at that, but they don't then vote SNP. So there is strong emotional ties. And of course we're a country in our own right. We still had our own education and legal structures. So it's a very strong emotional tie, and I can see how seductive the argument is next year. So that's why it's that line can be quite difficult. And at least a third of voters will be voting yes, and 1.3 million are currently undecided, and that's frightening. So that those that think this is cut and dried are very foolish, because it's not. And they've got more money. Yes?
What happens to current members of the armed services in the UK and the RAF?
Very good point.
Who are from Scotland?
Very good point. Well, the employment is with the RUK, the rest of the UK, because they're British Armed Forces personnel. There has been quite a dramatic downsizing, as you know, but their employment will be for the UK, so there wouldn't be UK forces based here.
I mean, have they taken an oath when they joined the service? I mean, in the United States, we take an oath or whatever. I can't imagine.
Some oath to Queen, but the Queen's still head of state, you see. So I don't know if the Queen's been asked, but that's another story. So the issue would be there will not be RUK armed forces based in Scotland, because it's a foreign country. Of course, there'll be a Scottish Defence Force, so that will be they will obviously have to advertise for that, and of course there'll be some people in the current force that want to transfer over. But these will be new regiments, be starting from scratch on that. So sitting current armed forces personnel will remain with the RUK and won't remain in Scotland.
So they essentially would lose their home.
Some of them are not based in Scotland currently, of course. We have a lot of troops in Germany, although...
No, I guess I'm thinking of people from Scotland who are in the UK armed forces, maybe abroad or something.
Yes.
And then this were to occur.
If this occurred, they'll remain as employees of the UK government army. But if you've got a slightly reduced, if you've got an obviously considerably reduced economic area and landmass, you might not need the same armed forces that you currently have. That's the other point. Yes?
When Marco came in for the SNP, he talked about some of the issues, and I discussed the political differences with England and Scotland in terms of the conservatism of England and perhaps the relative leftist nature of Scotland. And I pointed out, well, England had a Labour under Tony Blair, and for a long period, and wouldn't it be good for Scotland to be able to kind of influence the broader political spectrum across the UK? So I mean, we currently have a leftist position, but we can influence, more broadly politics across the United Kingdom. So if you take the bigger view, if you stand for these values, that would be beneficial. His response to that was, well, the Labour of England was very different from the Labour of Scotland. So even if Labour came in to Parliament in England, it would be a much more centrist, much more conservative Labour that wouldn't reflect the leftist views of Scotland.
There's not
So
a nice,
how would you reply to
there's
that?
not a nice way of saying this, but that's just complete mince. Well, as you know, I served in Westminster, and obviously I know quite a few of the current members of the Labour group there. It's also a convenient little, radical Scotland myth that the SNP put around as well. Like Scotland, got us a Labour government, and because all the Tories are in England. The majority was 150, and there was 40 odd Labour MPs. They can't do maths very well either. That's just not the case. I mean, of course, I'm not knocking the elements of radicalism in Highland and Scottish history, like the Highland Land League, for example. The Red Clydesiders and so on. That's a different argument to saying that your Labour MP in Scotland is a different creature to the one in London. I mean, London, for goodness sake, West Ham, Bethnal Green, there's some very radical parts of London and Manchester and Wales. So I just would completely refute that. It's because that argument's quite embarrassing to them, that's the issue. And it's back to, wouldn't it be great if the Tories went forever, that does create the environment for independent Scotland, and I understand that. But since it's not going to happen, the argument forever, I mean, the Tories aren't going to be in power forever. They're in a coalition, as you know, and the coalition partners, notwithstanding the by-election, I think are still pretty badly wounded, and I expect them to do quite poorly at the election in 2015. Mince is a technical term, technical Scottish term. Yes?
Question about the new voting age,
Yeah.
16 to 18. How much focus or resources do you think will go to that age group in either campaigning this thought or?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, as you know, the current position is 18 for elections in Scotland, and the new position would be that 16, 17-year-olds would get a vote. As a number of years ago, ex-social worker, I've got some worries about just the technical issue here, because that means that 14-year-olds would need to be on the register, because you normally record your son or daughter a year before their age, so currently it would be 17. But if, and the vote's next year, so current 14-year-olds would need to be on the register now, because that's what happens the year before. So the worry from a child protection point of view is you've suddenly got an identifiable group of 14-year-olds that, it's going to be a real worry in child protection terms. There is some provision for having a registration and address not published, so I'm just pointing out there is a technical worry about that. Yes, of course we are. The assumption is that, young people are going to vote en masse for SNP. The Glasgow University, okay, it's only one sort of showed, I think that's not necessarily the case, although in fairness they would be older than that particular age group. But my point I'm making, I suppose, more is young people in a much wider, probably up to 24. There hasn't been a lot of work done with 15 and 16-year-olds. My worry is that they're not going to vote, and they're not going to be registered, and it's going to be hard to get hold of them. I mean, we've certainly been doing, as all people are, parties are doing. I mean, I'm certainly, speaking to schools. Head teachers are quite concerned, and I've felt a real, I don't want this politicalised, and I can understand that. So the answer is yes, we'll be doing as much work as we possibly can. Clearly, using social media is going to be very important for that age group, and clearly making sure the messages are appropriate to young people as well. So yes, that is a very important area. I would imagine the SNP will really be hitting that age group, because it was their baby to introduce that. So yes, that's a good point. Yeah.
Just one more comparative question, because I wanted clarification for me. So one of the elements for Quebec separatists is they want to be their own republic. They want to break out of the constitutional monarchy, and I just don't know enough. If Scotland did become independent, would the Queen still be the head of state?
Well, again, that wasn't their policy before. So they had to change the policy. They're saying that the Queen will be head of state now. That the Queen is well respected in Scotland, and obviously there are anti-monarchist groups and so on. But thanks for coming. There is some. It was a serious question. I don't know if the Queen's been formally approached, but I would have not thought the Queen would want to have given up part of the UK. So from that point of view, that was quite an important point for the SNP, because if they were going to have some other form of head of state, they would have had a lot of criticism about that. So going back to the point about what's going to be different, You know, get away from the Braveheart sort of view, you know, we have our freedom sort of type point. I mean, you're going to have the same head of state, it's the Queen. You're going to have the same currency, the pound. You're going to have possibly still membership of the EU and NATO. You're going to have interest rates set by the Bank of England, and probably financial controls, I mentioned earlier about regulatory controls, are going to be the same. So basically what I say is, what sort of independence is that? You know, I mean, how different is that from what we currently, what is it you can do with an independent Scotland you can't currently do under the existing situation? Because there's massive setting up costs here. I mean, no one really knows, there was a leaked memo from John Swinney, no one really knows how much it costs to set everything up from scratch, because all the UK-wide bodies will not be operating in Scotland. They just think it's just going to happen. It's not. They're not going to be part of Scotland anymore, because they're not part of the UK. And they will have to be set up from scratch. And that, what we know from experience, reorganising local government was a complete financial nightmare. We know the single police force in Scotland, which in fairness, my lot did support, but that's not to say we're uncritical about centralisation. There is real worries about, you know, losing civilian jobs and everything else for if you have bigger units. I'm concerned about setting up costs that are going to be involved in, and the main thing is uncertainty. And uncertainty for business means not investing. And that's a concern. Because remember, we want to encourage indigenous business people to invest in Scotland. We also want to encourage outside investors. And inward investors are clearly saying, well, we're not sure what the economic position is going to be. We don't know what the tax is going to be. Is it going to be a race to the bottom, or is it going to be, you know, is it going to be higher tax rates? Is that going to put us off? There's going to be the cross-border issue, different tax rates, different sides of the board. So all these things are causing, you know, a lot of uncertainty. But I think there's a world of difference from a country completely doing its own thing and completely separate and starting again to a country that's just going to be a pale imitation of what already exists. Yeah.
When did the UK's credit rating get downgraded?
Just a few weeks ago.
Oh, okay.
It's just the one below. I think there's 17 different ratings, so it's gone from AAA to something like AA+.
I've got two financial questions. One is I've heard it mooted that we could have our own currency.
Yeah.
As I was just showing our visitors from the States, our nice Bank of Scotland notes that since the Act of Union reserved the right to create our own currency. So that would resolve your issue about a foreign country setting our interest rates, but then there's presumably issues there in terms of setting up our own currency. The second financial question was concerning the national debt that we would take on board. Has anyone set a figure for that? Has that been discussed?
The John Swinney thing I keep mentioning, I just got in the way out, so I haven't had the chance to really analyse it, but there is something in his memo about the share of national debt. So normally in the negotiations you would go, you know, because some of that, I remember in Westminster they just finished paying the States for the debt we had for the Second World War, so I mean, we do pay some of the debt off, but so it's not like they're saying, well, that's all these folks south of the border's problem, you know. I mean, this was, you know, just taking the debt analogy, this was debt we needed to fight and win the war. Hello, you know, Scots have got a right to pay that back as well as folk in England and Wales. So, I mean, there's no way they can just walk away from this. You know, normally you would just do a tenth, this is the rough rule of thumb, because that's the population share. So, but I mean, that's going to be quite serious. But the other point I made earlier, if your credit rating is lower, the cost of that debt is higher. The issue on currency, yes, they could issue their own currency, which won't be, which would not, obviously not be the pound. I think there would be some. I think there'd be some, because I saw some of the pictures of the older Scottish currencies that was had, and that was quite interesting. First point is, I'm not an expert in this, but I would have thought that there'd be some issues around the EU membership about that. It's, you know, you can either do the euro, because you've got to be an exchange rate mechanism in the euro, or you can have the currency which you previously used, because that's an opt-out. First point is, would you get an opt-out to use the pound? But bringing in a completely new currency, I think there'd be lots of question marks, as all the existing 27 countries have to agree, Scotland coming in. And again, I think there could be a difference between, say, you want your own currency and the exchange rates, because obviously there's the issue about where the currency would float with the pound and the euro. The exchange rates, they've said, will definitely be the Bank of England. So that would be irrespective of what we do. So because that's the rate that the cost of borrowing money, which is currently 0.5%. So I would be very surprised. I mean, again, the costs of starting up a complete new currency, albeit it might have had antecedents from before, would again be horrendous. And the danger of the new currency, where there's uncertainty, is there's a great danger of a run in the new currency if there's a lot of economic uncertainty out there. And that's why having the strength of a larger unit is much better. Yes?
I think you've made some really interesting practical points, but I like the theoretical stuff because
Oh.
it's much more fun.
That sounds like a hard question.
But, like all independence movements, one thing that they have in common is, they're moving for self-determination.
Yes.
That's extremely
Yes.
important.
Yes.
So, what if the Union remains?
Mm-hmm.
David Cameron's floated around the idea of an EU referendum.
Yes.
The
Yeah.
EU is relatively popular in Scotland as a concept, maybe a little less so in England. It remains in the UK, so Scotland remains in the UK, and then the EU referendum comes up later, and the UK leaves the EU. And the only way for Scotland to be in the EU would have been to have taken independence and then made an application.
Okay. Well, you're right to say that's the timescale. I mean, first of all, why is David Cameron, doing this? Is because he's really worried about UKIP, which are the very anti-European movement, which came second in the by-election, actually beat the Tories in the by-election in England easily, wasn't it? Yeah. So it's no any secret why he's doing this. He's trying to fend off his hard right MPs and the voters. Who feel very concerned about the recession, and in many occasions, I'm probably simplifying this, in many occasions are very worried about incoming workers from other countries, and that's caused a lot of problem, particularly in the south of England and in some of our large cities like Birmingham in particular. So I think that's just, I'm simplifying it, but clearly that's the tactic, and it didn't work. It didn't work at the by-election. So how can this come about? It can come about if Cameron wins in this coalition, most likely in 2015. I've already said I don't think that's going to happen. It's not going to happen because I think we're ahead of the polls. I think UKIP might do reasonably well, but in some Tory seats in England, which of course is not going to help David Cameron win the election. Probably the good guide to see how they're doing will be the European elections next year, because they came second last time round. I think we were third actually, so it's probably not a good indicator. But if they do quite well there, that might be quite a good indication. Seeing how the polls show up, but they're going to have a real fight in their hands, and it's mostly the Tory seats, and this is going to happen. I'm not saying we're immune from them, but so I don't think that scenario will come about. I mean, if there was a referendum, I mean, frankly, it could be quite tight, because there is clearly a large anti-EU movement out there, fed by papers like the Daily Mail and so on, and a lot of it is rubbish, but there's no doubt that people have genuinely held views about it. So I'm not saying because people want to leave Europe that they're bad people. I mean, that's again a democratic right that they have. I think it would be a disaster if we did that. And I just said it's the largest market, coming out is the largest market. So then there would be barriers against British goods being sold in Europe. I mean, how crazy would that be? So very, very, very annoyed about that. And of course, there's a lot of myths around about projection. I don't get a job because I've seen someone from, France coming in who's their own colour of skin from me. I mean, that is going on, and again, I'm very concerned with that approach.
But being that there is the difference between England and Scotland on an issue like that, do you think the Scottish people feel like they're a part of the same project in that sense?
Well, I just think we're doing two leaps of faith here. I think whilst I think your old man on the street knows about the referendum next year, I don't think it's in everyone's consciousness there's going to be a referendum on Europe. I think the thing we've got to get over is this is going to be. I think there will be a series of events, by the way, because I think if the SNP lose, they'll come back again, and there will be the constitution. But they want to stay in Europe, SNP, and we want to stay in Europe. I don't think there's a strong move in Scotland to come out of the EU.
No.
So I don't think. I mean, the scenario is interesting. I just don't think it'll happen.
Yeah. No, I don't think so.
Okay, have we have time? Are we? I'm okay for your time. Right, plenty of time for other questions. It was fantastic.
You were talking about the increasing devolved powers that we have in Scotland. So obviously we want more power, or I'd say the Labour government want more power, just like the SNP. Do you think it would become a point where Westminster will say, hang on a minute, we've given you enough, like if you're not going to be independent, you want to have the union, but we keep
Well, it's the old
these powers.
sort of perhaps cliche comment that Donald Dewar made about it's a process, not an event, and I think it's really important that that we looking at having more appropriate powers to give us more clout to do things we need to do. For example, the social housing I mentioned, to give a plan that's most appropriate for Scotland within the devolved settlement, using this still having the strength of the UK. It would depend, obviously, on the political complexion that we're going to face. I mean, in fairness, the Tories agreed to Scotland Act 2012, so that went through. If there's further approaches to it, who's to say? Certainly, if it's a Labour government that's back in, obviously it was Labour that I was part of that government at the time that accelerated this through. So almost within months, we got the Scotland, Act through for 1998, and people thought that would never happen, and so certainly Labour's totally committed to that. And in fairness, I haven't seen lots of evidence that the Tories are, and certainly not the Liberals, because they're quite keen on this federal solution. So it's about, yes, I think there's lots of room for having more appropriate powers. Where I think I personally would have limitations is, don't want to have embassies, I don't want to have armed forces, I want to have more powers to help people achieve social housing and economic renewal, and that's the sort of limits I would put in that particular argument. Yes.
Okay, now this may not be a good question, but
It's okay.
someone born in the UK or in England has moved to Scotland. They become a Scottish citizen if it goes through, and the same thing for the reverse.
Right.
There was a whole issue with citizenship, right, and passport and all that.
Yeah, could I just wind back a little bit just on about eligibility, just to be clear. And as far as the referendum is concerned, the people who can vote are those registered to vote, in Scotland. There's some issues about foreign voters as well, but it won't complicate the situation. And the younger voters that we mentioned earlier. So Scots who've lived all their life in Scotland and next year get a job in Middlesbrough.
Other integrated countries, I'm just thinking of...
Yeah, if I could just do the bit in the voting, right? Move to Middlesbrough next year, don't get a vote in the referendum. As far as the citizenship issue, it's a sort of wider issue. You will not have a UK passport because we're not part of the UK. You will have to have it's another cost, passport. You have to have your Scottish passport. There may be, I think the SNP have said something around dual citizenship. Again, this is just another, we're an independent country. We'll have the same rules that other countries have about who's a citizen and who's not, and you can make an application. If you marry someone, it has to be for that area and so on. But there is still issues around that because it will be a foreign country. And in the same way that we've got close bonds with France and Germany because they're key players in the EU, but they are foreign countries. They happen to be part of another partnership which happens to be convenient for marketing and so on. But you don't become a French citizen because we're part of the EU. That's the point I make. So there's still some question marks. So it's good to raise that because there's uncertainties around that. Yes?
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that the SNP might have been a little bit too certain about their continued membership in the EU post-independence, and that they might not have received legal advice and whatnot. But going off what John said about Scotland kind of having a tradition of being more in favor of the EU and holding a lot of the same values as the European Union. What do you think? I guess one of the arguments out there is that the EU would definitely want a country like Scotland to be a part of the EU. So
that's fair. At one level, I'm not going to talk to Scotland because Alex Salmon's point at one level is reasonable. We obviously there is strong assets in Scotland, in fishing, strong assets in renewables, particularly my neck of the Woodlands Islands where we've got strong opportunities for wave and wind power. There's obviously oil and gas, although both are in decline, but nevertheless there is, so Scotland's an attractive, recognisable country, which, yes, I'm sure other EU, the other 27 or 26 would may well agree over the period of negotiation that Scotland joined. The point I'm making is we're not automatic. This is a period of negotiation. There's going to be a massive impasse, and there's no certainty on this, which is another effect it has on jobs and investment in the area. So, and what I find strange is, whilst I've got different opinions obviously with SNP and what they want to do, if their raison d'etre is independence and their policy position is continue with the Commission, with the European Union and remaining with the pound, you would have thought they'd have sought legal advice, wouldn't you? I mean, this is a key, totally understandable, nothing strange about this at all. And it was only we dragged it out of them that they hadn't sought legal advice on this. So they don't know. They do not. Now, you can quote various academics, but there is a custom and practice that you get technical legal advice on these issues. And at the end of the day, other countries have to make decisions. And remember that they've got areas like Spain, who've got areas of their countries who's got nationalistic support, as you know. And it is creating bits of precedent. Now, I know we can make the argument that Scotland was independent country before, and we can't compare regions of Spain with Scotland. But nevertheless, you've got to put yourself in the shoes of people making decisions in these other countries, and there'll be serious, there's serious concerns about what's going to happen. I mentioned Serbia before. They're concerned that Croatia are going to get in soon. They are getting in soon, and then veto Serbia getting in. And seriously, because each government's got to make a decision on this one. Why have this uncertainty? And it's something that's easy to predict. You know you want to be in Europe. Surely you're going to go out and seek advice. What's damaged the SNP in this one? It's not that they're wrong in an intellectual way. It's because they're seen as incompetent. I mean, that is a very basic ministerial thing to start out, isn't it? This is the first year undergrad in politics would say, surely that's what you want to do straight away. That's the first thing you want to sort out. I don't think they've sorted out native either, but that's another issue for another day. So you're asking voters to make decisions on a crucial decision where they themselves haven't got definitive answers, and that is really, really concerning, because it's them that developed this. It's them that set up the referendum. It's them that's setting the date. So I've got very great concerns about what our role in states will be, and I'm quite convinced that the rest of the UK would remain as the EU member state. So that's why it's a new application. So England, Wales and Northern Ireland will remain as a member, remain with the pound, and remain with the opt-outs. Okay, I've got time for some more questions if you've got questions that you want to ask, or just observations. Yes?
If it were to go through,
yeah.
I understand it's a very unlikely situation, but what would be the new first priority for the Labour Party?
Well, that's a good point. I think I think it's probably an area where Labour haven't done a lot of work in. But any political party has to be realistic and has to adjust to any new environment. Clearly, we would be up again, people like myself would be up again for election in 2016, assuming it's the same number of MSPs, it's the same electoral system and so on. But I assume that would happen. But again, it's another big question mark. We would have to say, we want to win control of an independent Scotland for Labour. And that would obviously be the objective that we've got. And we will find, because remember, we're not totally different camps. Like you've got SNP voters here and Labour voters there. Many folk don't vote at all, and many interchange between the two because we're both central-left parties. It's not like Tory and Labour voters, so there's probably not a lot of changeover. So people may well vote yes in the referendum and then vote Labour in the 2016 election. So we will have a lot of work to do. Hopefully, they would act in a collective way by involving Labour in negotiations with our equivalent in London, or certainly part of the negotiation team, and that would be certainly a very great collective thing for them to do. And it's going to be a massive change, for Scottish people. But we'll be up for that. We're not going to disband and go away. We would be up for fighting that election in a tough way. And how ironic would it be if we were independent and Labour controlled the independent Scotland? It could happen. Obviously it was a bad election first 2 years ago, but we were in power from '99, albeit in coalition. So.
Just to carry on from that question, actually, and I hate to put you in this position, but
right.
What would happen to the SNP in terms of a lot of what that party is created around is the idea of independence? So.
Yeah, that's a good point. You may or may not know. Originally, their argument was that if they got independence, they would disband and they would join Labour. Many of them were Labour members or are left of centre. I'm not in any way doubting their commitment to social democracy, but they're not doing that now. They would remain as a party and fight as a party in the 2016 2016 election.
I asked Marco that question because I was curious, and his reply to that was that he thought, just given the political demographics of Scotland, there's a large enough room for two centre-left political parties, which I thought was an interesting answer. But they thought they could define themselves in a way that would be sufficiently distinct from Labour to sustain itself.
And as you know, across Europe, there's a strong tradition of of independence parties being part of the administration. So I wouldn't expect they're not going to disband. And obviously the SNP to say, whatever happens, that's the case. If they lose the referendum, they will. I'm convinced they'll go again. And I was reading something today in the Scotsman that said there was an argument this constitutional debate is drowning out other debates, by the energy sectors. And someone was knocking this. Well, I'm sorry. The mere fact I'm here tonight, we've talked about the constitutional evening. It is drowning out other debates. And why are we having this lasting a year and a half? If they're so confident, have it tomorrow. Bring it on. Have it tomorrow. But no, it's a year and a half because they're waiting for different. There's Commonwealth Games, isn't there? And there's various interesting things happening next year that they think they're going to get Philip out of. That's why. And obviously they're waiting for the pole position to move. But I am concerned how many people are don't knows. That's a big worry.
Would you like to end with any?
Oh yeah, that's another resident speech. But it's been interesting to have a discussion with you, about it because I was telling my colleagues it's going to be like a general election that lasts a year and a half, and I know from experience I've fought 5 general elections in 2 Scottish Parliament. They are they're very demanding. Quite rightly, the voters have got to know what's going on. It's the same in the States, I know. But having an election, effectively election campaign this length is incredibly demanding. Because we're getting requests left, right and centre to go and address groups across, certainly my patch, which is huge, the Highlands and Islands. I'm not complaining about that. I'm really making the point that the length of time is very, very wearing, and it's going to be very, very expensive. But as I said, they've got deep pockets and they'll run a very glossy campaign. But certainly when we're speaking to groups, I don't normally do much on the fundraising side, but we, certainly in the business groups, we said to them, well, if you believe in our message, we need some help, because if we don't get help, they're going to outgun us. So it is a real problem. And as you know, probably in comparison with the States, we've got, particularly during the election campaign, we've got very tight spending limits. And I know when I was over in Baltimore, in my Westminster days, I met a group that was training some new senators and congressmen. They were telling me that they spend so, particularly in the House, you've got to spend so much time campaigning. It's almost like from day one. It was pretty wearing hearing that. Although, as a comparative to from here, they were also saying that there's so many safer seats in the House, and because the boundaries are done in probably a less neutral way than they're done here. So maybe that's the difference. But I wouldn't thank you for a 2-year term as the House is 2, isn't it? That is terribly demanding, particularly if you've got to fundraise. But we get some help from our political parties, but we get very strict rules on what we can do and not do. Of course, when you're campaigning generally, if you're doing press and media, that's about your general work as a member, same as in the States. You can get really good coverage. It doesn't cost you anything at all. So we try and work very hard on media and very hard on with Facebook and Twitter and so on to make sure that we've got a high political sort of profile, which I think is really quite important. But the money side is not one we normally get involved in a regular basis. So having to go and get money from businesses is demanding, because we know we're outgunned, and that is a worry. And money talks. It's the same as the States. It really talks. If you've got a £5 million campaign versus a £1 million, you will see a difference in how well you can project your message, how glossy the leaflets are, how much buys you can do in adverts, and so on. So that is a real concern. Yeah.
Perhaps I missed this, but are the deep pockets Scottish pockets, or will there be money from England coming into this campaign?
There will be some. The general constraint is we ban foreign donations, and that will presumably apply to this campaign. For the SNP, they had, I think it was from Ayrshire. This couple won the lottery, which is they got a few £1 million. They donated £1 million, and there was an ex-poet laureate get another £1 million. So yeah, there were Scots that donated, and we've picked up a little money, but it's not anything like that.
So there aren't limits on how much they can donate?
There's limits on during the actual campaign period. Yes, the Electoral Commission have a role, and they dictate what the overall limits on spend are. So there is limits sort of laid down. So there's some rules for the short campaign, that's the 4 weeks before, and other limits for before that. So yes, there is limits on spend, and there's also issues about what counts as spend and what doesn't count. So it's all quite techy, but it's certainly, talking to American friends, it's certainly a lot more prescribed than my experience when I was in Baltimore. But again, you'll be closer to the detail than I am. But it is a huge event. This is not just another little election. This is a very, very significant issue for us next year, and it is quite frightening, because as I said, if they win, that's it. We're not going to replay it Saturday after that. And that, is, I'm not totally sure, to be honest, whether, Alex Salmond had particularly geared up to having this referendum at this stage, because the majority they got was unprecedented, but, he's doing it, and obviously, particularly the fundamental wing of the SNP, I believe this is crucially important, because like Labour, there is different wings of the party, and the fundamentalists are very keen for, we want independence, we want it now, and that's what the referendum will deliver if it's successful. So feel free to donate, and it's a joke. Don't worry. Any other questions or points that you have? You should make sure you come back for the referendum. And I actually did that in one election. It was the 97 election when I first got in, when I had a friend who was involved. I can't remember what the movement was, but it was something, it was a sort of left of centre grouping in Europe, and there were not politicians, there were like editors and artists, whatever it was, and we had a whole group. We had about 20 come out and did some campaign work for me in Inverness, which was quite interesting. So that was a wider ranging political grouping, but that was very, very cosmopolitan group I had at the time.
So you could use students in your campaigns.
Yes, very, most definitely. Students are a very important force for us. And again, when I was standing for Westminster, one of the key groups was the Labour Club at St Andrews, which is quite prestigious university, and that was just a policy the party had of twinning key seats where are marginal with student bodies, and they were fantastic because they were young, hard-working, they've got a lot of time in, and I probably couldn't have done it without that extra support, which is unions and students. So, and I'm sure the Better Together has a lot of campaign has a lot of volunteers, as I'm sure the Yes campaign have, and students play a very vital role, in that. So, students interested? To let me know.
Thank you.
Thank you.